She was sitting in study hall when a girl slid a magazine across the desk to her. Not handed, slid. The way you pass something when you are not sure how it will land. Jane picked it up. She was 12 years old. She had spent 11 months believing her mother died of a heart attack. 11 months building her grief on top of that story, pressing her full weight into it, trusting it would hold. And then, in a school in Connecticut, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, she read that her mother had not died of a heart attack, that her mother had been in a locked psychiatric institution, that she had found a razor, that she had used it on her own birthday. The rest of the world had known this for 11 months. Her father had made sure she didn't. He cancelled the newspaper subscriptions. He called the school directly. He told the staff, "Do not discuss this." He managed every information channel around his 12-year-old daughter with considerable deliberate effort. He missed one magazine, passed in one study hall, by one girl who had no idea what she was handing over. Jane sat there and read it. Nobody had told her. Nobody had planned to. She carried it alone for the next 53 years. Old Money Tragedy shows exactly what was inside it. Subscribe, so the weight is finally named. Frances Ford Seymour was born on April 4th, 1908, in Brockville, Ontario, Canada. She was the daughter of Sophie and Eugene Seymour, and she was, by all accounts of people who knew her before everything happened, a woman of considerable presence. She was educated, socially confident, and a distant relation of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. The daughter she eventually had would be named after that lineage. What nobody knew about Frances Seymour, not until Jane obtained her psychiatric records as an adult through lawyers decades after Frances was dead, was that something had been done to Frances when she was 8 years old. Something specific. Something that the records documented in clinical language that had never been named, treated, or witnessed in any meaningful way during Frances's lifetime. She had carried it from the age of 8 into her first marriage, into her second, into motherhood, into the rooms of houses where her children played jacks and where she smiled for photographs. She had carried it, and it had never been put down, and nobody had offered to help her with it, because nobody had been told it was there. That is the first thing to understand about the weight eventually placed on Jane. It was made from something already placed on her mother. In 1931, Frances married George Tuttle Brokaw, a millionaire New York lawyer. They had a daughter, Frances de Villiers Brokaw, known as Pan. George Brokaw died in 1935. Frances was 27, a widow with a small child and entirely capable of beginning again. She did. In September 1936, she married Henry Fonda at Christ Church in New York City. Henry Fonda was, at that moment, on the ascent toward becoming one of the most recognized actors in America. He had built a serious Broadway reputation. The Grapes of Wrath, in 1940, would make him something close to a national emblem, a man whose face the public associated with decency, with standing up for something, with a particular kind of American moral seriousness. He was celebrated for playing men who told the truth. Jane Seymour Fonda was born December 21st, 1937. Peter Henry Fonda followed on February 23rd, 1940. There were children now. A house. A name that appeared in columns. Everything looked like what it was supposed to look like. Jane, in those early years, was a tomboy. She has said this herself, in interviews and in her memoir. She was physical, unself-conscious, the kind of child who moved through rooms without calculating whether she was taking up the right amount of space. She played hard. She had not yet been told she should be smaller. Nobody had said it to her yet. She did not know what her mother was carrying beneath the surface of the household. She did not know that the woman she called her mother had been managing, without adequate help, the long-term damage of something that had happened to an 8-year-old girl in Ontario in approximately 1916. She did not know that her father was frequently absent: Broadway runs, film sets, 3 years of Navy service during the Second World War, and consistently unfaithful. She did not know that the marriage had been, by multiple accounts, unhappy for years. A child knows the surface of a house, the meals, the quality of morning light, the specific sounds of rooms. Jane knew those things. She did not know the weight beneath them. Henry Fonda's public face was spotless. He was the American conscience made flesh. Tom Joad carrying the dispossessed, Lincoln carrying the nation. At home he was cold, frequently absent, and when present, given to silence as a form of authority. His children learned early not to bring him their emotion. He responded to tears with contempt. He responded to need with withdrawal. Frances managed the daily, the children, the house, the continuity of family life. She managed it while managing something far older inside herself, something the records would eventually name, and that the household never named once. In August 1949, Jane was 11 years old. Henry Fonda came home and told Frances he wanted a divorce. He had been having an affair with Susan Blanchard, 21 years old, the stepdaughter of Oscar Hammerstein II, 23 years younger than Henry, 9 years older than Jane. He did not want to end the affair. He wanted to formalize it. He told Frances this directly. He was leaving her for someone else. Frances had been married to him for 13 years. She had 2 children with him. She was managing a mental health condition that had no adequate clinical name in 1949, in a marriage that had absorbed her identity entirely, in an era when a woman without her husband's name had nowhere particular to go. She accepted it, not because she agreed, because she had no means of refusal. She accepted it. She had no reason to believe what would follow. She did not yet understand that this moment was the first weight, and that having it placed on her without her consent made the next one easier to load. His name was Henry James Fonda, born May 16th, 1905, in Grand Island, Nebraska. He played Abraham Lincoln. He played Tom Joad. He played the kind of man who absorbs injustice quietly and comes out on the right side of history. The country loved him for it. His New York Times obituary described him as known for honesty and integrity. The country had been watching him perform it for 40 years. After the divorce announcement, Frances deteriorated rapidly. This is documented. She had attempted suicide at least once before her final hospitalization, throwing her wedding ring from a window at one institution and following it in an attempt that was stopped. By January 1950, she was admitted to the Austin Riggs Psychiatric Hospital in Beacon, New York. Henry Fonda told his children their mother was away. That single word covered everything. It explained nothing. That was its function. Jane was 11. Peter was 9. Away was all they had. Away was the shape of the absence. When someone is away, you wait. You do not grieve. You do not ask the specific questions that might crack the word open and reveal what is inside it. You wait, because away implies return. He chose the word deliberately. One word to cover a psychiatric crisis, a hospitalization, a woman who had been the center of their daily lives. One word, with no expiration date. Henry Fonda was not waiting. He was continuing his relationship with Susan Blanchard. He was making plans. He arranged, when Frances died, a private funeral. Only himself and Sophie Seymour, Frances's mother, in attendance. The children were not invited to bury their mother. He told them, heart attack. He sent them the false story, and told them to carry it. Then he called the school. This is the action that must be understood precisely. He did not simply neglect to tell Jane the truth. He took active, coordinated steps to prevent her from finding it out. He cancelled the household newspaper and magazine subscriptions. He contacted the boarding school where Jane was enrolled. He instructed the staff, and according to records, the student body, not to discuss Francis Seymour Fonda, not to bring it up, not to answer questions if Jane raised them. This required effort, phone calls, deliberate coordination, time spent by a celebrated man with significant public responsibilities, ensuring that his 12-year-old daughter could not access accurate information about her own mother's death. He called it protecting his children. Protecting them would have meant sitting with them and telling them the truth at the level they could absorb. What he did was manage the story around them. Those are not the same thing. What he gained from it: control of a narrative that reflected badly on him. A man who had left a mentally ill wife for a woman 23 years his junior, whose wife had then died by suicide in a psychiatric institution. In 1950, in the world Henry Fonda inhabited, Hollywood, Broadway, public life, that story had costs. A heart attack had no costs. A heart attack was unfortunate. A suicide in those circumstances invited questions he could not afford. Later that same year, the same year Francis died, the same year he delivered the heart attack story, the same year he cancelled the subscriptions and called the school, Henry Fonda married Susan Blanchard. She was 21 years old. Jane was 12. The wedding was in December 1950. Francis had been dead for 8 months. Susan Blanchard moved into the house. The rule settled in quickly. Francis was not discussed. Her name did not enter the rooms. She had no chair at any table, no place in any conversation. She had been administratively removed from the household with the same thoroughness that Henry had managed the information about her death. What he never carried: the conversation, the explanation he owed his daughter, the weight of sitting across from a 12-year-old girl and saying, "I lied to you. Here is what happened. Here is what I chose not to tell you. I am telling you now." He put that down. He handed it to her. He called it mercy. That is his portrait, constructed entirely from what he chose to load and what he chose to put down. The first weight arrived as a word. Away, August 1949. Jane was 11 years old and her mother had just been admitted to the Austin Riggs Psychiatric Hospital, and the word her father had chosen for this was a single syllable that created an open-ended waiting with no defined end. Away is not a word that resolves. It suspends. It creates a hollow tension in the body, a pulling, an incompleteness that persists for as long as the word persists. Jane carried this hollow for 8 months. She went to school. She played jacks with Peter. She waited without knowing what she was waiting for. That was the first wait, a waiting with no flaw. On April 14, 1950, Francis Seymour Fonda died at the Austin Riggs Psychiatric Hospital. She was 42 years old. It was her birthday. Henry Fonda told Jane, heart attack. The second wait arrived not as addition but as replacement. The heart attack story did not sit alongside Away. It closed it. It gave the waiting a flaw. Here is what happened. Your mother's heart stopped. Here is where the waiting ends. This is the explanation. It was the wrong explanation. Jane did not know that. She took it. She built her grief on top of it. For 11 months, that false flaw held. But something else was happening in those 11 months. Something visible, had anyone been looking. Jane has described, in her memoir and in documentary footage, the beginning of the eating disorder in this same period. At 12. In the immediate aftermath of her mother's death. The restricting. The purging that began as something she called, decades later, innocent, manageable, a way of controlling the one thing in her life that could be controlled when everything else could not. The body became the available territory, and she began, quietly, and without anyone naming it, to work it. The second weight changed how she inhabited herself. Nobody mentioned it. Henry married Susan Blanchard in December 1950. Susan Blanchard was 21. She was now the woman in the house, 9 years older than Jane. Within a short time, she became the person Henry used to deliver messages he did not deliver himself. One of those messages: you need to lose weight. You need to wear longer skirts. Another, from a stepmother, delivered directly to Jane: here are the ways you will need to change physically if you want a boyfriend. The third weight arrived through a proxy: the father's assessment delivered by a woman sent to carry it, because Henry Fonda had decided his daughter needed to hear this, and had decided he would not be the one to say it. This is documented in Jane's own memoir. This is the mechanism he chose: not a conversation, an intermediary, the judgment without the accountability. She was 12 years old. She was already restricting. She was already carrying the away and the heart attack, and the mother whose name was not spoken in the house where they now lived. And now she was carrying the information that the man she needed most in the world had looked at her body and found it inadequate, and had expressed this through someone else, because that was the level of engagement he had decided she warranted. 3 weights. She was 12. She was carrying all three simultaneously, and none had been offered with explanation or with any option to refuse. The 3 weights changed her posture, not as metaphor, as physical reality. She has described the hollowing that happened in adolescence, the scooping out, her word, the way the things that had been interesting about her as a child retreated, the physical ease, the unself-consciousness, the tomboy who moved through rooms without calculating the cost of presence. All of it withdrew. What was left on the surface? Managed, controlled, thin, exactly the shape the house was asking for. Then, sometime in 1951, a girl in study hall slid a magazine across the desk. The fourth weight was different from the first 3. The first 3 had arrived as things given to her, placed, handed, delivered. This one arrived as a sudden collapse of the floor she had been standing on. The heart attack was a lie. The world had known for 11 months. Her father had managed every information channel around her with deliberate effort, and had missed one magazine, passed by one girl who had no idea what she was doing. Jane understood, sitting there, that she was not going to be relieved of any of it. Her father was not going to come to her and correct the record. The school was not going to convene and explain. The weight was hers. It had been placed. It was staying. She was 12 years old. She carried it home. The first weight, away, looked from the outside like a father softening difficult news. One gentle word instead of the clinical truth. A man finding the least frightening language for a frightening situation. What was actually inside it? An entire history that had been withheld. Frances Seymour had not simply become unwell in the winter of 1949. She had been managing what the records would eventually identify as bipolar disorder for years, decades, in an era when the condition was not named, not adequately treated, and not considered anything other than a deficiency of character. She had also been carrying, since she was 8 years old, the damage of childhood sexual abuse that had never been named at all. Not in her lifetime. Not in any clinical encounter during her life. Jane would find it in the records, more than 50 years after her mother's death, in the language of psychiatric documentation from an institution that no longer had anyone to answer for what it contained. Away had contained none of this. Away gave Jane nothing with which to understand her mother's condition. Nothing with which to hold the refusal to go downstairs. That March afternoon, when Frances came home for a supervised visit, when Jane was upstairs playing jacks with Peter and was called down and did not come, as anything other than a cause. Frances had retrieved a small china box from the house that day. She carried it back to the hospital. A razor was inside. She had planned ahead. 2 weeks later, on her birthday, she used it. She left a note on the bathroom door warning others not to enter. Jane did not know any of this. She knew away. She knew heart attack. And into the silence between those two words, she inserted herself, her refusal, her resentment, her absence on that afternoon, as the explanation for everything that followed. She held that guilt for decades, because nobody gave her anything else to hold. Someone had packed this weight carefully. What was inside it was not accidental. The second weight, the heart attack story, looked from outside like a father's attempt to spare his children from unnecessary pain. What was actually inside it? A coordinated architecture of concealment, not a soft omission, not a father who didn't find quite the right moment. He cancelled newspaper subscriptions. He called the school. He briefed the staff. He built and maintained a false story with institutional cooperation. Because the true story, a suicide in a psychiatric facility by a woman he had left for someone younger while she was already in crisis, was damaging to the public image of Henry Fonda, and that image was worth protecting. The heart attack and the away together produced something that neither produced alone. Away had suspended Jane's understanding, left it open, unresolved, a question without an answer. The heart attack story then provided false closure beneath which the real story sat, inaccessible. She was no longer in a state of open not knowing, which at least presents itself as a question. She was in a state of false knowing, which forecloses the question entirely. She could not wonder about what had happened to her mother. She thought she knew. The wondering, the path toward the truth, was closed. The grief she built on that false floor was structurally unsound. When the floor gave way, the grief had to be rebuilt from nothing, without preparation, in a study hall, alone. The third weight, the magazine, looked from outside like an accident, a gap in the management, one publication that slipped through. What was actually inside it? The revelation that the world had been watching. The article the girl slid across the desk was not a private letter. It had been in circulation. People had read it. The death of Francis Seymour Fonda, its real circumstances, the psychiatric institution, the razor, the birthday, had been newsworthy enough to print in a magazine that a girl at a Connecticut boarding school could pick up and pass to her friend. The world had known for 11 months what Jane had not known. Not because the information was unavailable, because her father had decided she should not have it. What the three weights together reveal as a system, this was not poor parenting in the diffuse, unintentional sense. This was management. Henry Fonda had a specific problem, a public story damaging to him, and he managed it by controlling what his children knew. The cancelled subscriptions, the school instructions, the heart attack story. These were reputation decisions made by a man who treated his children's grief as a variable in that calculation, not as a reality with its own standing. Jane was not collateral damage. She was the managed party. She had not been shielded. She had been used as a container for a story that was more convenient than the truth. The weight she placed on herself, the guilt about not going downstairs, was constructed by everything that preceded it. If she had been told the truth about her mother's illness, she would have had a framework. She would have understood that the afternoon she stayed upstairs playing jacks was not the cause of April 14th. She would have had the information to hold those two things separately. She had not been given that information. into the silence she had inserted herself. She held the guilt as a fact. For years, for many years, she had been carrying all of it, for longer than anyone had noticed. And inside each weight, someone had placed exactly what they needed her to hold so they would not have to. What changed first? The body, not as metaphor, as documented clinical reality, stated by Jane Fonda herself in her memoir, in documentary footage, in interviews across 5 decades. The eating disorder began at 12, same year as the heart attack lie, same year as the study hall, same year Frances became a closed subject in the Fonda house. The restricting began. The purging began. She has described its beginning as something that felt manageable. Innocent was her word, a way of controlling the one available territory when everything else was beyond her reach. Anyone who had known her at 10, at 11, the tomboy, the girl who ran without calculation, who played jacks, who moved through rooms without monitoring herself, would have seen something shift. The ease left the body. A quality of vigilance entered it. She stopped inhabiting herself and began managing herself. Those are different things. One is a child living. The other is a child already in service to a judgment that has been placed on her. The eating disorder lasted 47 years. That is the specific number she has given. She has said she assumed in her 20s she would not live past 30. She stopped finishing the sentence about her own future. She had always finished sentences. Nobody connected the two things. What changed next, and this is the part that requires the most attention, was what the body became in her hands once she was no longer hiding inside it. In 1981, Jane Fonda published a workout book. It went to #1 and stayed there for 2 years. In April 1982, she released Jane Fonda's workout on VHS tape. It became the first non-theatrical home video in history to top the sales charts. It sold 17 million copies. It spurred VCR sales across America. It launched the modern fitness industry for women, opened gyms that had been male-dominated to female membership, and originated phrases, "Feel the burn," "No pain, no gain," that entered the permanent vocabulary of American culture. She released more than 20 exercise videos over 13 years. By 1984, her wealth from acting, producing, and the fitness franchise was estimated at $50 million. Here is what that means, stated plainly. A girl who had been told at 12 that her body was wrong, by a father who sent a proxy to deliver the message because he could not be bothered to say it himself, built a $50 million empire teaching other women to manage their bodies. The woman who could not finish a sentence about her own future in her 20s became, in her 40s, the most visible body in America. She stood in leotards and leg warmers in front of 17 million people and said, "Feel the burn, work harder, push through." She was bulimic for the entire run. This is the part nobody discusses when they discuss Jane Fonda's fitness empire. The tapes were recorded while she was managing a 47-year eating disorder. The woman who became the cultural authority on what a healthy female body looked like was privately doing what she has described as leading a secret life. Restricting, purging, assuming she would not survive. She built an industry on the surface of something she was barely surviving underneath. The father who told her she needed to lose weight did not see this. The stepmother who listed the physical changes she would need to make to be loved did not see this. The 17 million people who bought the tape did not see this. They saw the leg warmers and the leotard and the woman with the perfect body and the phrase "feel the burn," and they pressed play. He told her body was wrong. She built a $50 million empire on top of that wound. The empire was real. The wound was also real. Both were there, simultaneously, for the entire run. What changed last? The capacity to be present in a relationship without managing herself out of it. Jane Fonda has spoken about 3 marriages that she has described, in varying degrees of specificity, as organized around what other people needed her to be. The accommodation, the disappearing, the making of herself into the right shape for the room. She has written, "Almost everything interesting about me scooped itself out and took up residence alongside the empty, disembodied me." Her words, the hollowing that happened in adolescence, the withdrawal of the self that had existed before the weight arrived, expressed itself for decades as a particular kind of relational inauthenticity. A woman who had learned, at 12, that her body and her presence were subject to other people's management, and who had spent every year since trying to manage herself preemptively before anyone else could. What never changed? The need to know. This is the thing the weight could not reach. Whatever had been taken, the ease in the body, the capacity to finish a sentence about the future, the ability to be in a room without calculating the cost of taking up space, the need to understand what had actually happened, survived intact, the need to go looking, to obtain the records nobody had offered to open, to sit with the clinical language of a hospital that had treated her mother in 1950 and find, inside it, the thread that explained the thread that explained everything. That survived everything they put on her. It is the most important thing in this story. There is a difference between the moment a weight is revealed and the moment it becomes unbearable. The study hall was the revelation. The unbearable arrived in the decades that followed, in the accumulation of carrying what had been revealed, in 3 marriages organized around managed absence. In 47 years of a body she was barely surviving. In a relationship with her father that remained, until the very end of his life, organized around the enormous unspoken thing between them. Henry Fonda died on August 12th, 1982. He was 77. He had been sick for years. Before he died, Jane went to him. She told him she loved him, and she forgave him, for whatever didn't happen. That is the precise phrase she has used in interviews. Whatever didn't happen. It covers an enormous amount of territory in 4 words. It covers the conversation he never initiated, the correction he never offered. The moment, at any point across 30 years, when he could have sat across from his daughter and said, "I lied to you. Here is what actually happened to your mother. You deserved to know. I am telling you now." That moment never happened. He also did not leave her anything in his will. He left his estate to his widow, Shirley Fonda, and to his adopted daughter, Amy Fishman. The document stated, according to the New York Times, that the decision was not, in any sense, a measure of my deep affection for Jane, Peter, and their half-sister. He noted they were financially independent. Jane has not spoken about this with notable bitterness. She was financially independent. But the act of a father removing his children from his final accounting, children he had left to find out their mother's cause of death from a magazine, passed by a girl in a study hall, is its own kind of last statement. He managed the story to the end. He managed it past his own death. The weight became specifically unbearable when Jane began writing My Life So Far, published in 2005. She had decided to dedicate it to Francis. She has explained this decision in precise terms. "I knew that if I did, I would be forced to really try to figure her out. To dedicate a memoir to someone is to commit to the attempt to understand them. And understanding Francis required opening every weight, all of it. Everything placed on her at 12, carried forward, the lie, the guilt, the closed subject, the body, the managed surface, needed to be opened and examined and seen. She obtained the records through lawyers, She sat with them, and in the clinical language of a psychiatric institution, 70 years after the fact, she found what had been inside everything all along. Not a woman who had been arbitrarily broken, a woman who had been given something to carry at 8 years old that had never been put down. The sexual abuse documented in those records had been present through every institution, every marriage, every hospitalization. It had been there when Francis met Henry Fonda on a film set in England in 1936. It had been there in the house where Jane and Peter were raised. It had been there in January 1950 when Francis was admitted to Austin Riggs, and in April 1950 when she came home for a supervised visit and retrieved a small china box and carried it back to the hospital with her. The razor was inside the china box. She had planned ahead. She left a note on the bathroom door, warning others not to enter. On April 14th, 1950, her 42nd birthday, she was found in the bathroom. The Associated Press ran it. Newspapers printed it. The world knew before the day was over. Henry Fonda cancelled the subscriptions, called the school, said, "Heart attack." Now understand the cold open again, completely from the inside. The study hall. The magazine slid across a desk in Connecticut in 1951. A 12-year-old girl's hands taking it, her eyes moving down the page. What she read was not simply the true cause of her mother's death. It was the confirmation that the world had been in possession of this information, while she had been the only person in her own life who was not. That her father had built a structure specifically to keep it from her. That the structure had held for 11 months. That it failed because of one magazine in one study hall, passed by one girl who was simply doing what girls do in study halls. She had been 12 years old when it landed. She would be in her mid-60s before she had all of it. What the weight left in the record. A paper trail that Jane Fonda spent decades completing. Her memoir. The HBO documentary Jane Fonda in 5 acts, released in 2018. The interview with Oprah on Masterclass, where she described the study hall scene in specific detail, the magazine, the girl, the passing of it, the reading of it, the speech at the Rape Treatment Center in 2014, where she stood before an audience and named, publicly, what she had found in her mother's records. The abuse that began when Frances was 8 years old. The way it had damaged Frances's capacity for intimacy and love. The way it had shaped everything. The marriages, the institutions, the inability to come downstairs on a March afternoon in 1950 and be the mother her daughter needed. All of it is in the record now, named specifically by the person who was kept from naming it for most of her life. Henry Fonda arranged for the story to be managed. His daughter arranged eventually for the truth to be available. What the weight left in the people who watched her carry it. Her brother Peter did not find out the truth about their mother's death until he was 15. 3 years after Jane, still by accident, still without anyone deciding to tell him. He carried his version until he died on August 16th, 2019. The staff at Jane's boarding school, who had received Henry's instructions and complied, who had accepted the directive to keep a child from the truth about her own mother, carried that participation without anyone ever naming it as harm. They would have called it following instructions. They would have called it tact. And then there was the girl who slid the magazine across the desk. She almost certainly did not understand what she was passing. She was 12 years old. She had come across something in a publication that involved her classmate's family. She handed it over the way you hand things over in study hall. Quietly, with the small social gesture that says you should probably see this. She could not have known that she was the gap in Henry Fonda's information management. That she was, without understanding it, the only person in Jane Fonda's life who told her the truth about her mother's death. Not a parent, not a teacher, not a counselor, a relative, a trusted adult. Not anyone who had chosen the responsibility of it. A 12-year-old girl in a study hall passing a magazine. Nobody chose to be that person. Nobody accepted that role. It arrived by accident, a single publication that slipped through a system designed to prevent exactly this. And it was done by someone who had no idea what she was doing. That is the most devastating detail in this entire story. Not the lie, which was deliberate, not the concealment, which was coordinated. The fact that the truth arrived by accident, that the only crack in the wall Henry Fonda built was not made by love or courage or an adult's belated decision to do right by a child. It was made by chance, by a girl handing something across a desk. That is what the system actually looked like from inside it, what the weight left in her. Jane Fonda flew into Syracuse. She had a driver take her to Ogdensburg, New York, where Francis is buried in the Ogdensburg Cemetery, in the Seymour family gravesite, beneath a large stone obelisk. She laid red roses on the grave. She has described the process of finally understanding her mother, not the mother she had resented for the absences, not the closed subject her father had decided should not exist in the rooms of his house, but the actual woman, the 8-year-old girl in Ontario who had been handed something at an age when no child should be handed anything, and who had spent her entire life carrying it anyway, without adequate help, without a name for it, without a single adult who had properly witnessed it. The minute I read that, everything fell into place, Jane said. I knew why: the promiscuity, the endless plastic surgery, the guilt, the inability to love or be intimate. And I was able to forgive her, and forgive myself. Forgive herself. For the afternoon she had not gone downstairs. For the jacks she had kept playing. For the refusal she had held as a cause for more than 50 years. That had never been a cause. That had been a child's guilt poured into a gap that the adults in her life had deliberately created and refused to fill. She laid red roses on the grave of a woman she had never been allowed to know while she was alive. She should never have been asked to carry the lie. 11 months. That is what it cost her at minimum. 11 months of a 12-year-old girl's grief, built on a false floor, carrying guilt for a death she did not cause, in a house where the truth had been cancelled, along with the newspaper subscriptions. And then 53 more years of everything that grew from those 11 months. The body she managed instead of lived in. The marriages shaped by managed absence. The $50 million empire built on top of a wound that was still open for its entire run. The 47 years of an eating disorder that